You can find my handsome face. Okay, one or the other, right? And that way, what do you do with that video if you weren't here? You take notes. So I'm reminding you that if you miss class, usually I think so far I've gotten it done by 5 p.m. every day that we've had lecture. So my guess is I'll be able to keep doing that. So if you miss class, or you have to leave early, we have one student at Reedley, and Reedley has an early out every day at 2 o'clock, and he rides the bus, so he's got to leave. He can still get the lecture from this class, even though he's already been gone, because he can go home and watch the video and take notes. Not as fun as in class, and I know there's more distractions at home, but at least you can catch up. And, let's see, what else was I going to say? Oh, yeah. I think that what you need to do is make a habit, if you have missed any time, is on Friday, you could make up everything you missed that week. And you'd be within that 7 days. So I'm going to try to remember, but I'm not telling you that I'm going to hold myself responsible, but I am going to tell you I'm going to try to remember on Fridays to say if there's anybody that needs to do makeup work, today is a good day to do it. But if I forget to say that, does anybody remember whose responsibility is it to do their makeup work? Is it mine or is it yours? Yours, okay. And just to be really clear, and it's okay if you don't agree with me, the intent here is not to make it harder for you to get a decent grade. It's for you to get used to being responsible for being an employee as a pilot. Because you get a job, I don't care pretty much anywhere it is, and if you have some issue, you're the one that has to initiate taking care of it. All right, so we're on to Chapter 3, the decade before World War I. If you happen to be doing the reading assignment, which I'm sure hardly any of you are, in the book, it's called Early Aviation, but you don't have to write it down. I actually changed the name of this lecture to The Decade Before World War I. So does anybody remember when did World War I start? I don't care about the month. In the 1900s? Yes, that's the correct century. It did occur during the 1900s. I'll give you another hint. It did happen before 1920. Does anybody know? Does anybody know? 1914. Yes. World War I started in 1914, and when was it over? In 1965? No. 1925? No. Man, that would have been a 21-year World War. It was 3 years later. It started in 14 and it ended in 17. So we're going to really be talking about things that happened after the Wright brothers kicked in, but before World War II. Because when World War II started off, and we're going to get into it a lot later, when there is a war on this planet, like World War I or World War II or Korea or Vietnam, then the military budgets in the countries involved in those wars gets bigger, and so they spend more money designing and building newer, faster, better, more lethal and deadly flying machines. So that's what's going to occur in World War I. So we're going to talk about what happened after the Wright brothers in 03, 04 or so. So what happens effectively between 04 and 1914. So we're going to talk about flying in Europe, that decade before World War I. The first airplane flight in Europe, you notice I say airplane because balloons and dirigibles had already been flying in Europe from the balloons started in the 1700s and dirigibles started in the 1800s. And the first gentleman to fly an airplane in Europe was a gentleman named Santos Dumont. He was from Brazil, but he was living in what country? He was in Europe. Where was a bunch of the flying happening in Europe? France. So he did it in France, even though he was a Brazilian native. He was a rich guy. His dad had coffee plantations or something like that in Brazil. And it was in 1906 is when the first airplane flight occurred in Europe by Mr. Santos Dumont. And here's a nice picture. Looks kind of like a kite with wheels on it. And I can't even see the engine in this picture, but okay, I'm okay. It's all right. It's a box kite. That's fine. I don't mind. So I think that's kind of funny that it took somebody from Brazil to be the first airplane driver in Europe. But more people. Here's a guy named Farman, built an airplane in France. Wow, let's see, the elevator's in the front, the person in the engine's in a biplane with some wheels, and in the back, there's the tail. That looks a whole lot like somebody else's airplane. The Short brothers in Ireland, and don't worry, you're going to have to memorize all of this for the test. I'm just kidding. Literally, the brothers, their last name was Short. Does anybody know anybody named Short? I know Eric Short and Robert Short. I went to aircraft mechanics school with Eric Short here. In any case, in Ireland, wow, dig that. They got rudders in the back, a person and an engine in the middle, and elevators in the front. Wow, skids. Man, that looks like a familiar design to me. Blaireau in France. Thank goodness, Mr. Blaireau. He had a better. His does not look like the Wright brothers. He's got one wing instead of two. It's got a fuselage with the person in the back, the engine and the prop in front. And both the rudder and the elevator is in the back. You don't have to write that down. But Blaireau, and that's how you say it. Not that my French is that good, but this T is silent in his last name. And he took his airplane, and he was the first airplane. You notice I didn't say dirigible. He was the first, or balloon. He was the first airplane to fly across the English Channel. If I showed you a map of the world, how many people could not point out the English Channel? Remain seated. Oh, okay, so nobody knows where the English Channel is. All right. The English Channel is between England and France. It's in the Atlantic Ocean. The smallest distance across the English Channel is about 20 miles. When we get into World War II, we'll talk about D-Day and the invasion of Normandy that occurred across the English Channel. You have a question, Jared? The channel goes underneath it. Yeah, the channel is the Channel Tunnel, and they have electric locomotives, electric trains that they built tunnel. It's like 20, 30 years old now. You can go from London to Paris, and it goes under the ground, under the ocean, across the English Channel for 20-some miles, comes up in France and keeps going to Paris, and they're like faster. I don't know if they're bullet trains, but they're over 100 miles an hour, I think. In any case, yeah, that's the channel. I was alive when they built that. All right, so there's Blaireau again. A guy named Sikorsky. I like Igor Sikorsky because people call him the father of helicopters. He built the first practical helicopter. Well, we'll talk about that on another day. And, man, he's wearing a hat and a mustache. I want to know what that box is up there by his right hand. I don't know what that is. But he built an airplane in Russia. He ended up immigrating from Russia to the United States. If you want to have a discussion about the contributions of immigrants to the United States, including Igor Sikorsky, see me after class. The Taube, I think I'm saying that right, out of Germany. I love this one. This one's the most fun-looking one because they made it look like a bird. If you look at the wings and the tail, it looks like a bird. But it flew. It flew. You notice that the number on it, this isn't the original one, this is like a replica. And so it's got modern end numbers on it. Can anybody tell what this letter is right there? D is for Deutschland. So the registration numbers in Germany all start with the letter D. The registration letters in Canada all start with the letter C. The registration numbers in the United States start with the letter N. Here's de Havilland in 1912. They built a pretty fun airplane. Finally, at least we got like 3 airplanes now. We got Blaireau's and the Taube and the de Havilland here that don't look exactly like the Wright brothers. Finally. And you may not notice, but this airplane ended up being built for use in a war. It's hard to see. I don't think it has machine guns on it yet. Maybe. I can't tell if that's a machine gun or not. In any case, this is the basic configuration of many of the airplanes that were used in World War I as fighters and bombers. Engine in the front. I love the smokestacks going all the way up. Most of the smokestacks that went down. And this had two people in it, probably one to drive and one to shoot the machine gun, but I can't tell if that's a machine gun or not. So effectively, I am not going to say, name 7 of the 6 different early airplane manufacturers in Europe in the decade before World War I. That would be silly. I mean, I could be silly, but you don't want me to be that silly. But a good question would be, what was happening in Europe in aviation the decade before World War I? And you would say there were a lot of airplane manufacturers in a lot of different countries that started flying regularly. That would be a really good final exam question. Is there anybody in here that does not know what to do when I say that would be a really good final exam question? Because if you don't know what to do, I could give you a hint. All right, let's talk about flying in the United States prior to World War I. Now, in earlier classes, I've talked about the EAA, the Experimental Aircraft Association. That's a club. It's a lot bigger and better than just a club, but that's not the Aerial Experimental Association. This was 4 different people that got together, McCurdy, Bell, Selfridge, Baldwin, and Curtis. And they said, we like flying machines, and we ought to hang out and talk about how to design airplanes and build them, and we would have much better and more awesome flying machines if we all worked together, so they did. So this is in addition to the Wright brothers doing their thing. They built 4 different models of airplanes across a 2-year period from 08 to 09. And each one was better than the last one. They were doing it kind of like the Wright brothers were, that they'd build one, figure something out, and then they'd build another one, and it'd be better than the last one. So, of course, what happened in 08? What did the Wright brothers do with the U.S. Army in 1908? They sold an airplane to the U.S. Army. So the Wright brothers had a head start by far. And here's a picture. Elevator in the front, rudder in the back, person sitting in the middle with an engine and a fuel tank. And it has wheels, not skids. Awesome. What ended up happening is Curtis, you don't have to write down his first name, but Glenn Curtis, he ended up forming a company, which his name Curtis is like Curtis Aeronautical Limited or something, I can't remember. He designed and built more and more airplanes, and he was a better businessman than the Wright brothers were. And he sold airplanes not to just the U.S. Army, but he sold airplanes to the United States Navy. And if you want to watch a good movie about early naval aviation, you can write this on the side. I won't ask you on a test. It's a John Wayne movie, and it's called On the Wings of Eagles. And it's the story of a naval aviator who started learning to fly in the Navy. And I think it was either just before or it was just after World War I was over. Because the U.S. Navy did not fly airplanes in World War I. The U.S. Army did, and not the U.S. Navy. Anybody a John Wayne fan? Remain seated if you're a John Wayne fan. Good. That way everybody can pass the class. I'm just kidding. You don't have to be a John Wayne fan. So here's one of Curtis's airplanes. 3 wheels. And he finally put the rudder and the elevator in the back of the airplane. And it's hard to see from this picture, but he actually put ailerons here between the wings. Instead of at the back of the wing like they are on modern airplanes, it actually has an aileron over on the right-hand side of the wing, and there's an aileron on the left-hand side. When the Wright brothers started, they actually warped the wing and changed the shape of the wing to make a wing go up and a wing go down. Curtis actually put in separate ailerons to do the same thing, to make one wing go up and one wing go down. So what I find really interesting is that it was a Curtis-built airplane that was the very first airplane to take off from a ship on the planet. In 1910, I got a nice picture of a Curtis airplane taking off from a ship, and there it is. It did climb. It went down and then it went back up, so it was a successful one. So I don't know if it was Glenn Curtis. I don't think it was him. but it was a Curtiss-built airplane that was the first aircraft to take off on and off of a ship. And interestingly enough, they didn't turn around and fly and land. It took till the next year before, I don't know, I haven't researched this pretty much at all. It took them till the next year to turn around and take an airplane and land it on a ship. So I don't know what the issues were. Well, I don't know. I'd be more worried about stopping. But I don't know. Had anybody in here ever take off and land on a ship? I've only done it on a flight simulator. So I would if somebody let me sit in a jet airplane and land on an aircraft carrier. That'd be fun. So here's a picture of the first landing on an air. It's not. They just put a strip on the back of a battleship. I can't remember what the name of the ship was. Darn it. So I think that's rather interesting that in 1910 and 1911, a Curtiss-designed airplane took off and landed on a Navy ship, and it wasn't a Wright brothers airplane. So there's a couple of reasons why Curtiss was so successful over the Wrights. You can write down, it's not on the slide, but you can write it down. He was a much, much better businessman. He knew how to go out there and try to get military contracts and how to get the headlines in the newspapers and stuff like that, and he knew really well how to run a very big business. Also, the second reason is that the Wrights stopped flying for about 3 years. And the reason they stopped flying is because they were trying to get patents for their airplane so nobody could copy the designs. And they were worried if they went around showing everybody their airplane and they didn't have their patent approved yet, everybody would copy their airplane and they wouldn't make any money. So they stopped doing anything for about 3 years. Guess what Glenn Curtiss was doing for that 3 years? He was designing and building better and better airplanes. So he effectively caught up and in some ways passed the Wright brothers on the quality of airplanes. And there was actually lawsuits that the Wright brothers filed against Curtiss for patent infringement. Said, hey, you did stuff like I did, and you got to pay me money for it. And Curtiss said, no, I didn't. And they played lawsuit for many years. The Curtiss company had exhibition flying. They put 3, 4, 5 airplanes and a bunch of pilots, and they'd take them on road trips. And they'd go to county fairs, mostly state fairs, I would guess, because county fairs aren't big enough in the country, and do air shows. Exhibitions. But the Wright brothers ended up catching up and doing it too. They said, oh man, we got to catch up. So the Wright brothers started doing the same thing. And you could go to Curtiss and you could go to the Wright brothers and take flying lessons if you wanted to. You could pay to take flying lessons. Not a lot of this was happening, but you could finally take flying lessons. Question? And of course, people crashed, people died, airplanes broke. You got to understand, there was no formal system in the United States to get a pilot certificate. If you had the money, you could buy an airplane. That's on another slide, but usually if you bought an airplane from the Wright brothers or Curtiss or from somebody in Europe, they'll give you some flying lessons. But there was no minimum amount and say, okay, you got to go on 27 flights before you can solo or anything like that. It's like, well, you probably won't crash. Just want to go. Oh, bye. You pay. Great. And there was no pilot certificate to earn. There was no airplane mechanic certificate to earn. There was no Federal Aviation Administration saying, here's how safe the airplane has to be, or here's how much training the pilots have to have. Here's what you can do and can't do. Can you fly upside down under a bridge? Yes, you could if your airplane could do it. But... All right, I got a really short video here on Mr. Curtiss. I guess it's not that short.
I'm Dan Lynch, and this is a look back in time. One of the most significant figures in American history began life as a boy who was fascinated with speed. Now, I don't mean Evel Knievel or Mario Andretti. We're talking about a young man whose fascination with speed made him one of the great pioneers
designed and built
of human
motorcycles,
flight.
And for a while
And
there,
it all began
before he got into flying,
right here
he was
behind
the
me
fastest human
on
the
this
planet
lake.
because he had designed, built, and driven a motorcycle 100 to some odd miles an hour. And it was
Glenn
faster
Hammond
than
Curtis was
anybody
born
had
in
ever driven a
Hammondsport,
vehicle
New
on
York
the
in
ground.
1878. Early on, he became fascinated with bicycles, with how fast he could get them to go up and down the mountain roads that surrounded his hometown. As a young man, he married a woman named Lena Neff and opened a bicycle shop in Hammondsport.
Bicycle
Pretty
shop.
soon, he discovered that if you attached an internal combustion engine to a bicycle, you could get the thing to go pretty damn fast.
Look at that. That's a V8.
It wasn't long before Curtis was manufacturing motorcycles and racing them, and getting them to move faster than anybody had ever gotten a motorcycle to go. In 1903, he set a motorcycle land speed record at 64 miles an hour. 4 years later, Curtis set a new world record of nearly 137 miles an hour on a motorcycle.
Woo-hoo.
Wright, and also free,
That's
but
pretty
with
fast
no
back
spectators,
then.
amazed from the beach in Hammondsport. The Curtis effort was the world's first officially witnessed flight. And that was just the beginning of it.
Take the
Curtis
hat, man.
won
He's
a
got
race
he's
at
got
the
one of them
world's first
hats.
international air meet in France. He made the first long-distance flight in America from Albany to New York City. He created the Curtis Aeroplane and Motor Company. His company built aircraft for the U.S. Army and Navy. And during the years leading up to World War I, his experiments with seaplanes led to sweeping advances in naval aviation. Curtis civil and military aircraft were predominant well into the World War II era. Glenn Curtis became rich and famous to a degree that he never dreamed of.
Glenn Curtis was awesome. All right. Don't worry, we only got 5 more minutes left. Interestingly enough, it was not federal governments or state governments that issued pilot certificates. It was aeronautical clubs, aero clubs. In particular, 2 or 3 in Europe and 1 in the United States. And of course, they promoted safety. They didn't want people to crash. The United States government didn't start issuing pilot certificates and mechanic certificates until 1927. That's 10 years after World War I was over. World War I was over in 1917. 10 years later, in 1927, was the first time the federal government started issuing pilots and mechanic certificates. Excuse me. Harriet Quimby was the very first female pilot certificate. Guess who was the first male pilot certificate? I can't remember. It's between 1 or 2 guys. Guess. What was their last name? Started with what letter? No. There were these 2 guys. They were brothers. They had the same last name. One of them got the first pilot certificate, and the other one got the second one. Yeah, it was the Wright brothers. But Harriet Quimby, 1911, I think we got a nice picture of her. She ended up being a barnstorming pilot, and sure enough, like most barnstorming pilots, she died in an exhibition flight. I hate when that happens. Don't you hate when you die in an aircraft accident? Has anybody died in an aircraft accident and you've been reincarnated and you can remember your previous life? Okay, Brandon says yeah. I think, Brandon, you must have been Chuck Yeager, right? Were you Chuck Yeager? Yeah, you broke the speed of sound. That was awesome, Chuck. Can I just start calling you Chuck? Oh, you heard it right there. He said, yeah, sure. Okay, Chuck, whatever you say. All right. There are also air shows. The first international air show was in 1909. Oh, sure. Yeah, you need to go back? This one? Sorry, thank you for letting me know. I appreciate it. My intent is to not click through the slides so fast you can't write things down. I just got all excited about meeting Chuck Yeager for the first time. Does anybody besides Brandon know who Chuck Yeager is? I think he's dead now. And, well, he had to die so he could be reincarnated as Brandon. Chuck Yeager is the first human being on the planet that we live on that what? That broke the speed of sound. He was in a rocket-propelled airplane, the Bell X-1, and he went faster than the speed of sound in October 1947. Huh? It was about 2 years after World War II. Yeah, the rocket plane dropped from a B-29 bomber. Hit the rockets. Woohoo! It was smooth. In any case, don't get me wrong. Chuck Yeager was a great pilot, but there was like 2 or 3 dozen other great pilots that were probably just as good as him. It was just happened to be the project he got assigned to, and he was the pilot who was flying it that day, because they usually had 2 or 3 pilots flying, and they'd rotate. The next flight would be the next guy. So it was just his turn. Okay, today we're going to try to go supersonic. Oh, yeah, it worked. Sweet. And he didn't die either. He was very unusual for a test pilot from the 1940s and 1950s. He lived to die of old age. I actually know a friend of mine who worked at the Smithsonian Institute, and he met Chuck Yeager. He said Chuck Yeager is not a polite person. He said Neil Armstrong, the first guy to step on the moon, was a very nice person. But that's all anecdotal information. I don't know. I've never met these people personally. All right, so the first international air show was in 1909, and I bet somebody in here can tell me what country it was in. En français. Is that how you say in French? In French? How many? We have 2 students of the French language. Oui. That means yes. It's like C in Spanish, except it's pronounced differently, and it's spelled weird. It's like O-U-I. Oui. Why don't they? Don't ask me to spell words in French. I can spell French fries. Well, there's probably a couple other French words I could spell. In any case, in 1909, the fastest airplane on the planet was 47 miles an hour, and the longest distance anybody had ever flown without stopping was 111 miles. That's like 2.5 hours. My goodness. So in 1909, but the Wright brothers had only flown 6 years before this. And Santos Dumont had only flown in Europe 3 years before this. So a lot was going on. This 10 years before the war, people were going crazy, not crazy, but they were getting very excited all over the United States and in Europe about designing, building, and then flying machines and doing it better than the last one. So this is an actual picture inside of one of the exhibit halls. It probably was the exhibit hall of the French International Air Show of 1909. You can look in the bottom right-hand corner and see an airplane, and in the bottom left-hand corners you can see 2 or 3 airplanes. But what gets me is that they have what looks like helium or probably then hydrogen balloons and a couple of dirigibles. They look like they are not rigid. They are non-rigid dirigibles. So this is an actual picture of the 1909 French air show. Not the part where they were doing the flying outside. This was the inside part. Anybody ever been to Comic-Con or a Star Trek convention? Yeah, they have a lot of stuff on the inside, huh? Yeah, but there's not that much on the outside. If you go to an airplane convention, they do it near an airport. You go to the airport, and then they got lots of airplanes. I think we'll stop right there. And tomorrow we're going to talk about the second half of that essay that's due in this class. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.